Lupin III Part 1, simply known as Lupin III in Japan, is the first Lupin anime TV series consisting of 23 episodes airing from October 1971 to March 1972. Considered by many to be the first anime created strictly for an adult audience, Part 1 stars the Lupin gang in a number of adventures, sometimes adapted from the manga and sometimes based on original stories. Despite only lasting for one season and suffering from generally poor ratings throughout, the show eventually became popular enough to kickstart Lupin's long-running anime career. It successfully translated the manga into animated form while establishing a lot of characteristics that would define the Lupin formula. The show is also often given the reputation as being one of the darker and more serious Lupin anime to date, and while that is true to an extent, I don't think this is the best way to describe Part 1. Instead, it's more of an experimental series that was forced to change direction because of the circumstances surrounding its production. But in order to tell you the whole story of Lupin's animated career, we actually have to step back a few years first to talk about the Lupin pilot film. This 12-minute short is the first official animated Lupin project produced as a joint collaboration between Toho and Tokyo Movie, the studio that eventually became TMS Entertainment. The idea was first suggested by Gisaburo Sugi, an animation director at Tokyo Movie who previously worked on the seminal anime Astro Boy. He pitched the idea to Tokyo Movie founder Yutaka Fujioka, who was interested in the concept and commissioned a CinemaScope pilot film to help the studio secure funding for an animated Lupin movie. The pilot serves both as an introduction to the characters and a loose adaptation of one of the manga chapters, as well as a demonstration of the themes of sex and violence that would be prevalent elements in the show. It was never meant to be aired publicly, but has on occasion been broadcast on Japanese television and is included as a bonus feature on Discotex Part 1 DVD and on Lupin III Master File. Regarding the pilot itself, it has some impressive animation for the time, with some of these movements looking super smooth, especially considering this was made over 50 years ago. The characters are faithful to the original manga designs, which mostly work, capturing the intense reactions and complexities in the cast's facial expressions, with Zenigata especially getting some great faces. The sole exception is Fujiko, who is drawn with the same face in like 75% of these shots as if it's frozen there. They really did her dirty. Unfortunately, the pilot is bogged down with an explanation of the characters and their abilities, showing us an assortment of unconnected clips and straight up explaining what everybody's about through narration rather than organically showing us how these characters act and behave. There is an interconnected plot in this pilot, but it feels like an afterthought, especially considering that Part 1 adapts the manga chapter this is based on to much greater effect. Still, it is neat seeing all these Lupin staples animated for the first time, like Lupin's masks, the Mercedes-Benz, Goemon's Zentetsuken sword, and Jigen's Smith & Wesson Model 19. And yes, the gun is a Model 19. I got that wrong in the last video where I called it a 357 Magnum, which technically refers to the bullet and not the gun. Just wanted to correct that while I had the chance. But there's also details that just seem out of place, like Goemon acting as Lupin's enemy, which is more a product of this being an early anime, but stands out in retrospect against Goemon becoming Lupin's friend later on. Also, there's this character Kogoro Akechi, based on the fictional detective of the same name, who only appears here and in one chapter of the manga, and who barely has any character. I'm glad Part 1 left him behind, as we didn't really need two police characters here. Anyway, the pilot film featured a number of talented individuals working on it, including the previously mentioned Gisaburo Sugi, Moomin director Masaki Osumi, Doraemon director Tsutomu Shibiyama, character designer and animator Yasuo Otsuka, musician Norio Maeda, and sound designer Mitsuru Kashiwabara. Monkey Punch was also involved during production early on, but eventually backed out as the project was becoming too much for him to handle. The team had treatments for potential Lupin movies ready to go as well, but these ideas would ultimately remain unproduced as the pilot failed to attract a single buyer to greenlight a film. This was likely because animation was still considered primarily for children's stories, and no companies were convinced that an anime for adults would make a return on the investment. However, TMS wouldn't give up so easily as they recut the film in 4:3 aspect ratio and started pitching it to secure a Lupin TV show, and eventually, Yomiuri Television picked up the series for 26 episodes. TMS put Masaki Osumi in the director's chair with a changing rotation of writers and key animators for each episode. Osumi adapted the style of the manga as closely as possible, carrying over the edgy yet still humorous tone and including as much adult content as he could, though it couldn't be as profane due to obscenity standards for TV. Part 1 officially debuted on October 24th, 1971, and right out of the gate the show did very poorly, with very low ratings for its first 2 episodes. It was clear to TMS that the series wasn't going to find an audience with its initial direction, so after the second episode aired, they requested that Osumi make changes to the show to make it more appealing. Osumi refused to comply, resulting in TMS firing him from the project, and now that the lead spot was empty, the studio brought in a then relatively unknown pair of animators, Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata. These two are famous now for being 2 of the co-founders of the legendary Studio Ghibli, but at the time, the 2 were animators at Toei known for the 1968 film The Great Adventure of Horace, Prince of the Sun. The 2 were working on an adaptation of Pippi Longstocking, but that project was shelved and they decided to take on Lupin mostly because Yasuo Otsuka, a mentor for the 2, was working on Part 1. They accepted under the terms that they operate anonymously, so they left Toei and worked on the show under the pseudonym of A Production. These 2 lessened the harsher elements and focused more on making the stories and characters charismatic and appealing. While ratings did slightly improve after A Production took over, it wasn't enough to convince TMS to keep the show running for more than 1 season, and production was scaled back from 26 episodes to 23. Despite leaving the airwaves relatively quickly, Part 1 gained a lot of traction in reruns as it was a pretty cheap show to run in empty time slots, and because of that, the Lupin III anime series would continue. It's largely because of the shift in directors that Part 1's style is kinda difficult to nail down. Many call this incarnation of Lupin the most immoral depicted in an anime, as the early episodes deliberately echo the tone and maturity of the manga. But while this reputation is true to an extent, after rewatching this show for this video, I realized that it doesn't tell the full story. Even before Miyazaki and Takahata took over, there's still elements of the playful and mischievous side of Lupin who doesn't take everything super seriously all the time. Because Osumi was fired midway through production, he left a lot of episodes unfinished, and the middle episodes combine the different characteristics of the 2 teams. The Osumi episodes weren't shy about portraying Lupin as a criminal who is willing and able to commit violent, hateful acts on a whim, up to and including straight-up murder, though thankfully much less sexual assault in the manga due to the restrictions of television. We see the events from Lupin's perspective most of the time, so we still ultimately root for him since the people he targets more often than not deserve it, but his sense of morality is certainly more twisted here. Osumi-era episodes also favor atmosphere and suspense over mindless action, as these adventures are never afraid to slow things down for a bit to draw out the tension. This show has more of an edge with these stories, with this version of Lupin dialing up the misanthropy, but also showing him more as a cool guy who's out seeking thrills and will stop at nothing to get them. And honestly, Lupin being a thief doesn't play into the story all the time. Yes, he steals things, but most of the time during the Osumi era, the thievery is born out of a major plot point and not the reason why an episode's storyline begins. By contrast, the A Production episodes are sillier and more comedic, placing an emphasis on hijinks and antics over slow, brooding atmosphere. Lupin's violence and sexual desires are heavily toned down in favor of portraying him as a goofy and carefree, yet still intelligent and determined thief who's always looking for something to steal. The pacing is more frantic in these episodes, with the animation showing quicker speed and wackier faces, matching the lighter personalities. Lupin and the gang definitely ramp up in frivolousness with these episodes, relishing more in having fun and the joy of stealing things rather than the more unsavory pleasures they would seek previously. A Production stories revolve more explicitly around theft and crimes than the Osumi episodes, with the thievery plot often being the genesis behind an episode's storyline, and it's only once the heist plot is either underway or finished that the non-thievery plot, if there is one, kicks in. If you want a more direct comparison between these 2 directorial styles, then there's no better place to look at than Lupin's car of choice. During the Osumi era, Lupin favors the Mercedes-Benz SSK, a car that the pilot film incorrectly attributes to being a favorite car of Adolf Hitler. Given the SSK's larger, longer frame, it takes up a lot of space and looks more cold and mechanical even with its bright yellow paint job. And considering its open-air design, it makes Lupin seem more intimidating as he isn't shielding himself behind anything and he has so much more room to move around him. For the A Production episodes, however, the Lupin gang will more often than not be driving a Fiat, not necessarily the famous yellow Fiat 500 that later installments show him in, but a close approximation. This car is more compact and rotund, squeezing its occupants into a tiny space and confining its characters more or less into one comfortable shape. It better matches his carefree personality and makes him seem much more like an ordinary guy rather than some daring criminal. On the subject of characters, let's look at how this first Lupin animated series adapted the manga's eccentric cast of misfits. Lupin is portrayed by Yasuo Yamada, a voice actor who was the official Japanese dubbing actor for Clint Eastwood. This was his first role in the Lupin series, and he would voice the character in every Lupin anime except Fuma Conspiracy until his passing in 1995. Yamada obviously had his work cut out for him, contrasting the many different faces of Lupin's personality, but he does it all with a surprisingly gentle sense of grace. Lupin is often an over-the-top character, but Yamada sounds like he's intentionally restraining from bursting out too much, letting his voice meld with the animation to combine into something that works wonders. There's a reason why Yamada played him for so long. His voice is a major factor in making Lupin's intelligent yet jovial demeanor work so well. Jigen is voiced by Kiyoshi Kobayashi, who is the official dubbing artist for James Coburn and Lee Marvin, but within the Lupin fanbase, this dude is an absolute legend. He started voicing Jigen for both versions of the pilot film in 1969 and continued to portray him in every single Lupin media except Fuma Conspiracy until he retired from the role earlier this year in 2021. That's 53 years he spent with this character and 53 years of giving a talented performance to our favorite tough guy gunman. Now, playing a character for that long obviously means his voice changes over time, and we'll discuss that as it becomes more relevant, but for his early appearances, it's interesting how he balances a cooler, laid-back personality with a more goofy and bubbly side of Jigen. Especially in the A-Production episodes, Jigen often acts more lackadaisical and spirited in Part 1, in a sharp contrast to his grittier and wearier personality later on. He still does his job as a foil for Lupin by prompting him to explain the situation, but it's done in a way that makes him seem more clueless? It's kind of a weird point, but I definitely picked up on a lot more silliness in this version of Jigen that felt out of place. Fujiko is portrayed in Part 1 by Yukiko Nikaido, who doesn't appear to have a lot of other acting credits and would only be involved in the Lupin series for this show. Nikaido does a serviceable job here, portraying a softer and more doting Fujiko, though her performance does feel all the more noticeably off because she only got one chance to play the character. A-Production purposefully de-emphasized Fujiko's sexiness and cold-hardiness in favor of a character who, yes, is sometimes manipulative and often acts independently, but can also be a major supporter and voice of reason within the group. Later shows dialed up her sex appeal quite a bit and made her a more active participant in the stories, but in Part 1, she never gets the chance to take center stage and grow her character, barring a few moments here and there. Even in the episode where she has the most development, she's out of commission for most of it, leading to an odd situation where she hovers in the background for a lot of the show. Goemon's voice actor in Part 1, Chikao Otsuka, actually voiced Zenigata in the TV cut of the pilot film, and his resume includes iconic characters like Joseph Joestar in the Stardust Crusaders OVA and Dr. Eggman from the Sonic series, as well as being the official dub actor for Charles Bronson. However, his work on the Lupin franchise didn't extend beyond this show, and if I'm being honest, I'm sort of glad for that. Not to demean Otsuka's talent, because he is an absolutely fantastic actor, but his performance as Goemon never really resonated with me. It's a little bit too nasally, too unrefined, not really capturing the calm, unwavering swordsman we've come to know him as. I understand they're capturing a younger Goemon here, one who doesn't have the full training of a samurai master, but I never felt like Goemon ever had much of an impact beyond his first few appearances in this show, and Part 1 is one of the only Lupin anime where I think he doesn't need to be here. Finally, Inspector Zenigata, who's a Tokyo Metropolitan Police officer in this show, is voiced by Goro Naya, known for being the official dub actor for numerous actors including Charles Heston, Clark Gable, John Wayne, Martin Landau, and Lee Van Cleef. Naya would continue to voice Zenigata in every Lupin media except Fuma Conspiracy until he officially retired from the role in 2012. Like Kobayashi as Jigen, Naya's evolution in the role throughout the years is something that's immediately noticeable if you compare the eras, and when you consider Zenigata's character, it's not hard to see why. Zenigata spends a lot of screen time screaming his lungs out, and it could not have been easy for Naya to maintain it over decades. But that's also why Zenigata is my favorite character in this series, because he's so intensely dedicated to his job and to catching Lupin, and Naya nails that right out of the gate. What's cool about Part 1 is that it doesn't feel the need to shoehorn in each of the 5 main characters in every single episode. Of course, Lupin always appears, and Jigen only rarely misses out, but Fujiko, Zenigata, and Goemon don't show up just for the hell of it. They're only used when it's deemed necessary for the story. That makes Part 1 storylines a little tighter overall, especially in the Osumi era, which is especially impressive seeing as how each episode has less than half an hour to tell its narrative. Where Part 1 begins to show its age is in the aesthetic elements, including the music composed by Charlie Kosei and Takeo Yamashita. This soundtrack was following up the score to the pilot film by Norio Maeda, whose jazzy, funky tunes for that project would ultimately establish the tone of Lupin's music going forward. Part 1, however, goes in a different direction that stands out as it was created before Lupin composer Yuji Ono started working on the series. This soundtrack takes on a smooth rock style with a number of influences from folk, western, funk, and jazz music, also featuring more vocals that mostly boil down to a guy singing Lupin the Third over and over again as if it needed to remind audiences what show they're watching. Unlike Ono's songs for the series, which have this sort of timeless jazz bend, Koisei and Yamashita's music is very 70s, almost acting as a sort of time capsule for the era. It's a good soundtrack overall, though not my favorite in the series. It does fit Part 1 very well, and the show's more minimalist use of its soundtrack helps mitigate the repetitive use of some of its songs. Unfortunately, the original tapes for this soundtrack have gone missing, meaning it's impossible to transfer over high-quality versions of this music without re-recording it, which is a shame as it's definitely worth a listen. You can find some transfers of the show's music and effect track online, but this isn't a perfect solution as those renders contain sound effects that often get in the way of the instrumentation. Since this is a show from 1971, it's obviously pretty dated in the animation department. Now, this animation was incredible for its time, and you have to remember that these animators were doing something unprecedented, so all things considered, this is objectively pretty good animation, especially when the action gets going. But watching this today, you can definitely see the seams coming apart and spot all the little mistakes and errors, in particular the lip movements. Yes, I know anime doesn't have lip syncing like works in the West do, but there's a number of instances where there are absolutely no mouth movements despite the characters talking. This is nitpicky, but the fact is a lot of viewers aren't able to watch older shows like this because they get distracted by the older production values, and I think it's fair to warn people who are interested in watching Part 1 of that ahead of time. But should you even watch Lupin the Third Part 1 to begin with? Well, I think so, but not immediately. I personally don't recommend you start here, as it is an oddity in the Lupin series and doesn't give you the proper impression of what the franchise is about, but I highly recommend it once you have some Lupin knowledge and want to know how the anime got its start. And for the Lupin TV shows, I'm going to list my favorite episodes from the series and highlight the ones that are essential to check out if you aren't planning to watch it all. So without further ado, here's my 10 favorite Lupin the Third Part 1 episodes. 2. The Man They Call the Magician. This episode adapts a classic chapter from the manga with the memorable villain Paikal, and also establishes the supposedly magical premise explained by a scientific method trope that many Lupin stories follow, and it's very interesting seeing Lupin struggle against this incredible force. 4. One Chance for a Prison Break. It's a slow burn for sure, but it's great at continually building on a simple premise, mostly being contained to one location. It's also the first show to really focus on Zenigata and why he's relentless in his pursuit of Lupin, a dynamic that I love seeing explored. 7. One Wolf Calls Another. The second episode in this series to feature Goemon, and one that's great at showing the relationship between him and Lupin and why the two become partners. The ending is one of the best in the series because of its absurdity and how it devolves from a conflict to an understanding without any real dialogue. 13. Beware the Time Machine. Another episode with a memorable villain, Kyusuke Mamo, whose time-traveling powers and scheme to eliminate Lupin to prevent him from spawning any heirs predates a lot of the series' occasional focus on fantasy elements, and the payoff for this episode is great. 14. The Emerald Secret. Here's an episode where Lupin, Fujiko, and Zenigata escape a traditional setting and confine themselves to a boat in the middle of the ocean, and also where the fun, light, and charming nature of the A-production era really begins to take hold and tighten itself up to create some delightful scenes. 15. Let's Catch Lupin and Go to Europe. I love Zenigata episodes, and this one is an absolute treat. It's definitely one of the goofier episodes in Part 1, but the game of wits between Zenigata and the Lupin gang is fantastic, and even the repetitiveness of its story doesn't get in the way of how lively and entertaining the episode is. 17. Lupin Caught in a Trap. A more serious story where Lupin, Jigen, and Fujiko are forced to steal 3 billion yen or else the bombs on their wrist will detonate. This one builds on tension very well, putting the characters in a dangerous situation and giving them little room to move around, making for a gripping watch. 19. Which third generation will win? This one is worth it for the finale alone. It's a battle between Lupin and a third-generation police inspector who was Arsène Lupin's rival, and while the first 2/3 are a fun little romp, it's the ending sequence, which I'm not showing off here as it's too good to spoil, that makes this one so awesome. 21. Rescue the Shrewish Girl. Admittedly, this one gets bumped up quite a bit because the middle section is fantastic, perhaps the best chase sequence in the show, and one that features a train rather than a car, but I also enjoy the female protagonist Rie and her conflict in reconciling the knowledge she has of her family. And 23, The Big Golden Showdown. This is a nice finale to the series. Ostensibly, it's about a gold heist and the Lupin gang's efforts to hide it, but the most compelling part about this episode is how much Zenigata is willing to put on the line in order to catch Lupin. I don't know if you guys can tell, but I really like Zenigata. And there you have it, the top 10 Part 1 episodes that are absolutely essential to watch if you want to check this series out. For those of you who are curious, here's my list of runners-up as well. What's interesting is that the best episodes, at least for me, are split between the Osumi and A production eras, and while I do slightly prefer the tone of the later episodes, there's still lots to enjoy in the early adventures. I've come to really appreciate Part 1 as a series, and rewatching the show for this video, I can see why it eventually found an audience. It personally ranks right in the upper middle of the Lupin anime shows for me, right behind Parts 2 and 4, and any fan of classic Japanese animation definitely needs to give this show a watch. Next up on the Lupin docket is Strange Psychokinetic Strategy, Lupin's first live-action movie and a very weird entry in the Lupin canon. Look forward to my retrospective on that next month. And make sure to subscribe and click that bell to get notified when I publish a new video. Until then, I'm Cloud Connection, and thanks for watching.